Interestingly, about the relation between the city and the village, I would like to say that not only has migration accelerated from Dhantala to cities, but daily commuting has grown in a big way. In 2014, I had counted that about 120, mainly men, were commuting daily from Dhantala. Uh, Also, for the first time, the village has started buying uh, professional services from the city. For example, in weddings, etc., the band, the decoration experts, etc., are hired by villagers also now. This is something new. About the state and the farmer, I've already dwelt a bit. Again, regarding poverty, I mentioned the significant decline occurring recently. But along with the decline in poverty, it is important to stress that some privations or daily sufferings have mounted in a big way, especially on the health front, with the growing contamination of soil, use of chemicals, etc., in the food chain, also falling water table, and even the rise of fake medicines and fake doctors are hurting the health environment. Also, the safety environment has suffered in a big way. Not only communal tensions have risen, but also crime had grown by leaps before 1914, especially under the Samajwadi government of Akhilesh Yadav, according to villagers. And this was one of the reasons they turned for the first time to vote for BJP in 2014. I would also like to mention here some, paradoxical decisions taken by the state, as for example, regarding farm suicides. P. Cyanite's work was, of course, much talked about, and it was shown that suicide rate has increased in the country from about 8 per lakh per annum to 11 by 2012. And the farm suicides, especially, were in news. But actually, when we look at the data more closely, the farmers' suicide rate is not higher than the national suicide rate. And also, I observed in Dhantala by examining about 20 suicide cases that the biggest reason for suicides is not poverty generally. In fact, we will recall that suicide rate is very high in countries like South Korea, in Japan, rather than states like Bihar or Odisha or Jharkhand. Suicide rate is lowest, in fact, in Bihar, whereas it is highest in Kerala, in Tamil Nadu, in Punjab, the richer states. So it has less to do with poverty, perhaps, than with the other problems like use of drugs, etc., and family strife, and so on. So that this needs to be revisited. I observed in Dantala too. Now, I have already explained my notion of culture, to which I turn now. In what ways has culture changed? As I said, the core of culture is the shared mentalities, which has 6 major segments: values, beliefs, loyalties, traits, emotions, and these are again at 3 levels: conscious, subconscious, and discrete consciousness, or what is known to the person but hidden from the world, from the outside. All these levels, mentalities can be studied. Given the time constraint, I'll just focus on one aspect of consciousness or mentalities, that is political attitudes and perceptions and relations with the state. Uh, as I mentioned already, Dhantala was founded in 1780s at a time of immense political flux, when the Mughals were on the decline and Marathas and the Afghans were vying for supremacy in the region, while the British were entering as noble force. Uh, Also, this region saw for the first time popular rebellions which had never occurred in India before the 17th century. The Jat uprising, the Satnami uprising, among, of course, the others like the Sikh uprising. These were unprecedented rebellions against the uh, state by the ordinary villagers, not just rulers or fights between Rajputs and Sultans, etc., but peasants themselves rising. And surprisingly, when the British entered the region in 1803, their arrival was not resisted or at the popular level. And the takeover was rather swift and not very violent. Of course, in 1857, the uprising included masses and both peasants as well as urban workers. But the story of Dhantara shows that the supporters of the British were not in small numbers either. In fact, the Zamidar of Todi, who was the Zamidar of Dhantara also, his name was Yahya Khan at that time. And in fact, he lived for about 100 years till early 20th century. And his family mentions that they had received a request from Queen Victoria herself for supporting the English contingent of Meerut. And Yahya Khan therefore sided with the British rather than with the rebels. Uh, this may be slightly exaggerated, but it goes to show that though from some farmers had attacked Meerut English families residing in Meerut in 1857, but all villages clearly did not join this rebellion. The anti-colonial struggle grew in late 19th century, of course, and Meerut was a prime center for the rise of Arya Samaj, the Muslim associations, and so on. Tilak had also visited Meerut, and however, villagers don't seem to have joined this Swadeshi movement or the home rule movement uh, in any way. The coming of Gandhi, of course, changed the situation completely. And not only the national movement entered the villages, but the Meerut merchant, Raghuveer Narayan Singh, who was a major follower of Gandhi, his processions received major welcome in village like Dhantala also. But active supporters of the national movement, even under Gandhi, were very few. In Dhantala, for example, there was one youngster called Soni Sunar, who was in fact expelled by his own family for siding with the Gandhians. Another limitation of the Gandhian movement, despite its, of course, unprecedented success, and as I said, for the first time reaching the villages, but on the debit side, the not only active supporters were few in villages, but also it had competition from Muslim separatism in some quarters, as well as followers of Netaji, the revolutionaries like Bhagat Singh, etc., who were critics of Gandhi. And from Dhantala, there was one soldier called Fakira, who had joined the INA under Subhash Bose. Because of him, Subhash Bose seems always in competition with popularity of Gandhi. Yet when Gandhi was assassinated on 30th January 48, uh, the villagers recall no one cooked any meal in the village, which shows of course, the silent popularity of Gandhi for villagers too. Now let's look at the electoral politics after independence. Congress remained hegemonic, and Mohsina Kidwai, for example, was elected MP for several times from Meerut. Uh, but this hegemony uh, was partly uh, uh, developed because of the flight of Ashrafs or many Muslim leaguers to Pakistan from the region. The major challenge then came from leaders like Charan Singh, etc. In 1967, in 1977, dent was made in Congress hold on the electoral politics, but real marginalization of Congress as on a long-term basis began only with 1989, when SP, BSP, and BJP started competing for the votes in the region at the expense of the Congress. And of course, 2014 should be till 2014. Dhantala had never voted for BJP in any notable way, but 2014 was a major turnaround, and BJP has been firmly in the saddle since then, securing up to 40% of the total vote uh, in different types of elections, from district, village panchayat to the Lok Sabha, etc. Now, what is the cause for this disenchantment with what are called secular parties and the turn towards BJP in a village like Dhantala, which had never supported RSS, etc. Although the Ram Mandir movement, of course, created big ripple here too. Uh, the villagers themselves claim that it is not because of what is called Hindu polarization or any communal prejudice against Muslims. They say that they are now voting for BJP because of their disenchantment with what was called secular appeasement of some Muslim demands, and also because the level of corruption, inflation, etc., pinched them very hard before 2014. On the other hand, the implementation of some policies like construction of toilets, etc., has been appreciated by villagers. Uh, among other long-term shifts in political consciousness, we can of course point out increased political awareness. Most people now know not only political parties' names and their symbols, but also candidates' names. Although there are major differences between gender and age groups in this regard. Another notable feature is uh, rising criticism of dynasticism and loosening hold of caste in electoral politics. Although caste remains a major factor, but it is subcaste and not varnas which vote together. This is something which needs to be underlined against prominent discourses in media, etc., which talk of, for example, Dalit vote. There is no Dalit vote in villages like Dhantala. There is Jata vote and there is Valmiki vote, which go differently. And even when we talk about Jata vote or Muslim vote, it is rarely more than 50 or 60% of the total segment that votes together for a party. There are other factional loyalties, there are economic interests, there is preference or liking for a leader of which lead to differential voting even within these segments. We can here raise another interesting question: why has the left party failed despite having strong trade union movement? And in case of Dhantala, for example, I mentioned that it was a communist leader called Satpal who had helped in a major way in the success of the distribution of land to the landless. Despite this, communists don't get any vote from Dhantala and have never won more than a couple of seats in entire Western Uttar Pradesh. What could be the reason? Uh, I think one reason is their stress on uh, the politics of the proletariat, which clashes in a major way with the politics of the farmer, who's the landowner. Secondly, their open anti-religion stand, also sometimes anti-national stands taken, for example, at the time of the Chinese aggression in 1962, etc., are recognized by the villagers also, at least those who are literate and read papers, newspapers, etc., uh, for reasons for having no appeal of the left in the region. As I mentioned, also the fact that the left's very understanding of the rural social structure seems flawed, both at the level of understanding the ruling class as well as the proletariat, as mentioned before. I've mentioned how the schools in Dhantala have performed. Lastly, let me just mention what are the major theoretical implications of our findings from Dhantala. See, first of all, we can see that the process of change is neither revolutionary nor cataclysmic. Neither has been there any breakdown nor any major sudden transformation. Although some radical measures were introduced by the state, like abolition of zamindari, for example, like attacks on patriarchy through new laws, uh, also the introduction of reservations for Dalits in jobs and education, etc. These were radical measures different from the traditional social setup and social values of Dantala. But in India as a whole, and as illustrated in this village also, the tendency has been to adapt to changes rather than uh, sudden breakdown. Among the institutions that have been transforming in the biggest way are the state itself, the democratic politics and constitution of India, the role of political parties and ideologies, and besides this, schooling and the introduction of new media. Uh, among the uh, customs and institutions that are persisting and changing at a slowest pace are religion, family, and aspects of beliefs and values. The institutions that have adapted in a big way without any major mutation are caste and the village community. The broad patterns in this dual of change and continuity in village social and cultural structures, we can identify major patterns as revivalism versus modernization, globalization and westernization, also non-Western global influences in cuisine, in religious organization, alternative models of social justice as coming from China, etc. These are broader at the broader level for the country as a whole, competing patterns in social and cultural change. It is evident that some of these tendencies have major contradictions. For example, rationality versus the traditional stress on customs and community, etc. Democracy versus hierarchy, which is traditionally entrenched through caste and family, gender, etc. These are there are serious clashes, obviously, in these cultural trends. Uh, these also result in ambiguities, flux, and uh, inconsistencies in lifestyles and value systems. One major example of a very contrasting Western value of privacy, for example, has slowly emerged now in Dhantala and is reflected in the fact that private bedrooms for young couples are now being built in houses, which was not the case in traditional housing. Uh, Another major and very contradictory values are reflected in modern entertainment, especially that which is available on satellite channels and mobile phones now, which clashes completely with the traditional values. And there is amalgam as well as confusion around these contrasting values and slow changes in, for example, the attire of girls in the village now and discontinuation of dupatta, not by all girls, but some girls increasingly, is reflected in these cultural changes. My study has, as I said, questioned some theoretical perspectives, especially the nationalist critique of colonial regime on some angles, not all, of course, and especially the Marxist understanding of rural class structure. But besides Marxism, my study also points to and challenges determinist ideas and economistic understandings of change and places a lot of value on understanding culture to be able to grasp the uh, uh, story of cultural change in any community. This is closer to the Weberian perspective rather than postmodern or Marxist perspective, and calls for long term comparative studies of culture and history through thematic history rather than national history all the time. Uh, but above all, my study appeals for clarity, brevity, reflexivity, rather than jargon and ideological correctness. With this, I conclude my talk, but I have some suggested readings for those who may be interested, which I'll submit to the Teaching Learning Center. These are on concepts and methodology. Then there are some on rural histories and sociologies. And there are some web links I'll give for very interesting lectures by Chomsky, etc., which enrich our theoretical understandings. And from my own field research, there are some writings which I have listed in the readings. I also want to acknowledge my assistants in fieldwork. Unfortunately, I don't have Vikas's photograph here, but Vikas himself was very helpful and one of the best uh, researchers who helped me in collecting data from Dhantala. This is an major door-to-door survey I did for the occupations in Dhantala over time and how they have changed, which can be of interest to some readers. So I conclude, and I hope I have provoked you enough to present some questions and challenges and criticisms. Thank you for listening.